a lecturer in history and literature at Harvard. She teaches, among other things, about the representation of gender in film and television across the Americas. On the occasion of International Women's History Month, we're inviting her as a film scholar to share some of her knowledge with us. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, June. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you.
One of the things that I was really fascinated by is that, I've talked to you a lot as a film scholar, as somebody who works on films, who's worked in Hollywood, who has a long history of involvement. But reading your syllabi here at Harvard, I'm actually so intrigued by your class, Imagining Latin America, and what it means about the representation of women. Could you tell me a little bit about that class?
Yes, in that class, among the things that we probed was the idea that there's this huge Latin American ethnic imaginary. And part of the goal was to break down this imaginary and recognize the different ways that the richness of cultures, for example, modifies this imaginary, or the way that richness of culture becomes erased through that imaginary. And wrapped up in that imaginary is a homogenization of the role of, for example, racial identity or gender or class or histories of colonialism and coloniality. So that's the kind of work that we were doing. We started with a unit on ways of seeing that tried to help students unlearn the way that we understand the world through Indigenous thought, through liberatory possibilities of Indigenous thought. And then we continue thinking about how colonial imaginaries are forged outside of the region through the work that Disney has done in trying to represent Latin America. Then we move to think about how different geographies or imaginative geographies construct certain politics of marginalization. And finally, we ended with a unit on futures, where we thought about what does liberation look like? So that's the work that we did. And I have to say, I had an incredible group of students and I learned a lot.
That's great. You're talking to a general audience, some of whom may be engineers or doctors and not really familiar with this word imaginary. What does that mean?
Well, I think the meaning of that word is very contested, but I'll share what it means to me. To my mind, an imaginary is not only how people see themselves, but also how others outside of the region might understand and construct Latin America as this homogeneous whole. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a Latin American ethnic imaginary. So in many ways, the way that this is imagined across cultures, spaces, and different contexts.
One of the things that really impressed me and intrigued me about your syllabus and about your life in general is how you manage to mix high culture and popular culture. And one of the things you had on your syllabus was Jennifer Lopez's performance at the Biden inauguration. What the heck does that have to do with the imaginary of women?
I'm so glad you asked me this. So first, to the piece on mixing low culture and high culture, I think that distinction doesn't exist for me because culture is culture. And I think particularly with popular culture, it is worth studying the things that people engage with, the films that people go to the theaters to see, the media that shows up on our phones every day. I use it as kind of an excuse to get at certain aspects of society and to understand them. To my mind, even though there's a lot of value in analyzing really high art pieces and works, that has such a limited audience that I think in many ways it doesn't help us understand society in the same way. Okay, back to J-Lo. We opened with that. We started talking about how J-Lo as a figure represents the tensions that is within the United States, and how for Latinx people in the Latin American diaspora, colonialism appears forged in so many ways in their bodies and in their everyday lives. So one of the pieces of the discussion was the use Spanish in her performance and how that speaks to the songs that she thinking that historically have promised that the US is an inclusive land, but also cover over the ways that the US has not been inclusive, particularly to Latin American immigrants. So what does it mean to have these songs that are so germane to the US as a national power insert Spanish, but also in the context of a presidential inauguration for a white president? Lots of moving parts. And that's what we talked about, particularly as her performance. She was all dressed in white with Chanel earrings. There's also a certain performance of class that's taking place there. So all these complexities we discussed. How does colonialism show up in this performance? And what can we say about it? So I've said some of the things that we discussed about it, but I think there's more to say.
But you've talked right now about race and you've talked about class, but you didn't speak specifically to gender. How does gender figure into this?
Okay. So gender is also a really important piece of this because for a long time, JLo has been one of the foremost figures of the myth of the spicy Latina, which of course has a very long history and a very fraught history. So the fact that she was the defiant figure that incorporated Spanish while also continuing this legacy of the United States as the land of the free, or like a land of beauty and inclusion, is also like a really important aspect of the way that these colonial structures of power show up in Latinx bodies, and particularly Latinx bodies of women.
Why colonial?
She is of Puerto Rican descent. And a lot of the discussions that we are having right now in the field have to do with what to do with Puerto Rico, right? So one of the biggest political discussions, not only in the field, but also in society, are, should Puerto Rico be granted statehood? Is it even desirable for Puerto Rico to have statehood? So to my mind, Puerto Rico is a colonial territory, not a state that will ever be granted equality, even through statehood. It's a nation, it's a country, and it should be independent. So this is how I'm thinking about how this colonial history shows up in JLo's body through these discourses of inclusion that appear in this performance while also being challenged in a number of ways.
So one of the other figures in your syllabus is Carmen Miranda. How does she relate to this whole discourse?
Well, talk about the spicy Latina, right? Carmen Miranda is a figure that's really complex. From the outset, she became the foremost representative of Brazilianness while co-opting a lot of the life and structures of, for example, Baianas and Black women in Brazil. But she herself was actually a white woman born in Portugal. So again, she came to Hollywood. All of a sudden, she became this like exotic figure that was hypersexualized, but also the comedic punchline. So again, the tensions of her existence and her performance are incredibly complex. There's an excellent book by Dr. Catherine Sanchez where she analyzes Carmen Miranda's stardom, which I highly recommend. And the way I see it, her stardom and the stereotypes that her stardom represented, it became a form of currency that allowed her to sell herself. On the one hand, she was the exotic and desired, that had the allure of the exotic and the unknown. And then on the other hand, she was a comedic punchline. So again, the tensions are mapped in her body in really complex ways.
Thank you. So you have the sexy Latina, but you also have the angry Latina. So are we talking about a change in time periods? Are we talking about women who are coexisting with their discourse? Could you tease that out a little bit?
So these stereotypes have existed over time in different ways. So on the one hand, you have Carmen Miranda, who's the sexy Latina. You have JLo also, who is the sexy Latina. But I think there's also other stereotypes that are coming to play that may indicate that these two images are not necessarily so different, right? Because the spicy irreverence of the Latina signals a particular, not only allure, but also a danger of a person who can't be controlled. So for example, while when one is assertive, right? There's this double standard that perhaps women can be seen as boss girls. But for Latinas, then this becomes a person who's completely laden with emotion, that this emotion cannot fit within the parameters of what is normal. I mean, there's of course change over time in the way that Latinas have been represented in media, but at the heart of it, it has to do with this history of standing outside of society and being marginal to what is seen as normal.
So when you're talking about, the wink wink, is it a kind of subversion? What's happening there? Are women really being strong when they're pretending not to be?
That's a really complicated question. For example, J-Lo, at the end of her film, she needs to be partnered up, right? So there's a sense that there's this heteronormative, heteropatriarchal way that she must be contained. And then I'm thinking about representations in like Coco or Encanto. I mean, I'm thinking about the role of women there and the kind of anger that shows up in the women characters, like the grandmothers, that also find different ways of being contained that don't necessarily have to do with romantic love. In that sense, one can see them as agency, but there's also a way that these kind of colonial structures of gender show up in these representations. And by colonial structures of gender, I'm thinking about what Maria Lugones calls the coloniality of gender, and the idea that indigenous people in the Americas had other forms of organization that then colonizers brought with them this idea of a binary and the way that women then exist in a patriarchal society. So there's that, right? We can choose how we read it. To my mind, it's very hard for me to find spaces of agency in these mainstream representations. I tend to find spaces of agency perhaps in the work of some of the films that are being made in Latin America today, in social media, in perhaps less structured spaces.
Let's go back to Coco. I think a lot of our listeners have seen it, and many of our listeners are fans of both Coco and Encanto. So could you tease out a little bit, maybe start with Encanto, because it's more recent. Tease out a little bit the role of women there.
I'm thinking a lot about this film right now because I'm writing an article about it, and I just taught it in the fall in this class. So one of the central questions for me has been, what about the representation of women in this film, right? You have this woman protagonist, you have this matriarch also that's in the film. And the question that emerges for me is it enough to have someone on screen that looks like me or that has some of the same identities as me to see myself? Is that enough? And to my mind, the answer is no, it helps, but no. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So for me, the film Encanto is a film that understands diversity. And I'm using this word really purposely because this is the word that has been used to talk about this film in terms of like the range of skin colors and the kind of range of representation, so to speak. But I see that diversity in this film is invariably filtered through ideologies that are germane to the United States, like exceptionalism. So, of course, we cannot separate the way that the film constructs gender from the way that it constructs race and ethnicity, as well as other factors of identity, such as class. So in many ways, the film reproduces the dynamics of empire in the kind of discourse of exceptionalism. So what does it tell us, for example, that in order to be matriarchs that inspire pride, we have to have gifts or magical abilities like Mirabel or Alma? This is not to say that I didn't feel something when watching the film. I definitely cried. For the first time, we have this Latin American protagonist. But the idea of meaningful representation and what meaningful representation is still contentious. So it'd be really simple for me to say, oh, this is a step in the right direction. But I certainly hope that this is not the last film with a Latin American woman protagonist. And I also think that women, and particularly women of color or Latin American women, which could be women of color or not, need to enter into the conversations at the top in the boardrooms and the creative teams, right? So that's how meaningful change happens. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of exceptionalism, and that's not going to shift the paradigm.
by nature protagonist is exceptional. No?
It doesn't have to be. You can have collective protagonists, and that would also help to shift the paradigm, right? It doesn't always have to be the individual. I think that the film's construction of community is something that gave me a little bit of pause in thinking about casita, the house being on a hill, being something that people look up to. And in many ways, that reminded me of this God-given right, which prompted a lot of discomfort for me. As I'm from Argentina, so someone that comes from a place in a country where this exceptionalism has caused incredible harm, physical harm, social harm. So no, the answer would be, what do we mean by exceptionalism, and what is the history of exceptionalism, and what kinds of harm has it caused? So no, I can't get behind it.
Okay, great. Sorry that I was so fascinated by the syllabus. What about the Gordita Chronicles? I haven't seen them. So could you explain a little bit and talk about the representation there?
I'd be happy to. So what I should note about Gordita Chronicles is that unfortunately, it did not get renewed for a second season, despite doing really, really, really well. And that's another conversation about what's happening to these like Latinx shows that make it into these mainstream United States streaming platforms, and why are they not getting renewed? And there's been a lot of work done in the press about this, but the show tells the story of this girl, Dominican girl, who immigrates to the United States. And we get to see that experience of a wide-eyed, hopeful child that arrives in the United States and contends with the idea of the American dream that can be more of a nightmare in many ways, right? So how does she deal with the culture shift and the culture shock of immigrating, but also transiting the world as a little girl that's constantly fighting the unrealistic beauty standards of having to be slender, having to be what others determine is beautiful, which of course comes attached to certain colonial standards of beauty. So she's out of the norm in many ways, and you see her in the show kind of skirting the rules or trying to find a way that works for her. So part of what we talked about and part of what I'm thinking about with this show is, what does it mean to put an Afro-Latina girl who is not, she's adorable, but she is not the definition of what we're used to seeing in popular media. What does it mean to put her at the center of the story?
What does it mean?
I think it means that the show is trying to contend with the ways that immigrating is an alienating experience. And sometimes this alienation is something that we carry with us because we exist in a world, or for example, this protagonist exists in a world that does not make room for her in many ways. Then I should note that the person who created this show is Afro-Latina as well. I am not sure about this, but I think there might be some autobiographical elements to this show. So what that means to me in the kind of larger picture is, yes, women, and particularly women of color, immigrant women, they need to be led into these conversations, or women who are living in the diaspora, they need to be at the top. They need to also be creative in the industry. And that's how we create meaningful change in terms of representation.
So do you have any idea why the show wasn't renewed?
I think there's a trend right now. This happened with Himpified. This happened with a lot of the shows that have a full Latinx cast. There is speculation that these shows have been endeavors that these streaming platforms have taken to be able to have really diverse offerings, but there's no real commitment to sustaining them and supporting them. But this is not something that I myself have researched, but I have read what other people have said about this. It doesn't surprise me, but it disappoints me, especially because these shows are doing really, really well. And they're actually, in terms of quality, they're fantastic. Their stories are well conceptualized and they're deeply moving. Maybe one of these days there'll be one that survives past the first or second season.
We can only hope so. So I read an article the other day about the fact that sullen, brooding Latinas are being portrayed in film and television. instead of what we've talked about happy exotic ones or angry ones. So is
Mhm.
this a trend? Could you talk about it? What does it mean?
In a way, it goes back to what I was saying before, the idea that this attitude is just another way that Latinas are kind of spicy or unable to fit into this mold or unable to be controlled. And I also think it opens up the door to a fetish that's just as harmful and perhaps not as distant to the exotic and happy Latina. So I think that anything that essentializes a whole gender or a whole ethnic group, and I'm talking about Latinas as an ethnic group, even though there's a real richness and difference that exists within that particular imaginary. I think that if this is a trend, it needs to go away. I'm thinking about how the idea of like being sullen and broody perhaps is an invitation to be conquered or to be dominated. Something about existing outside of these paradigms. Those are my preliminary thoughts. But I've been thinking about the disaffected Latina, the kind of like disinvested, that to my mind speaks to the same kind of inability to enter the mainstream.
So I'm wondering, when you go back to Gordita Chronicles and you're thinking of this little girl seeing the images of the slim, white, tall women, when women in Latin America, when Latinx women see these stereotypes about happy, exotic, sullen, brooding, angry, whatever the stereotype happens to be, is that forming their self-identity in the way that seeing beautiful, slender women makes a chubby girl want to be other than what she is?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. The way I see it is, for example, my own experience with Gordita Chronicles, I had a really profound experience of recognition because I immigrated myself and I was that wide-eyed. I mean, I wasn't a child, I was a young adult, but that kind of wide-eyed perspective and hopeful perspective that was then met with lots of barriers to access, barriers to culture, and to see her be persistent and work around in ways that are really germane to her culture was deeply reassuring for me in the sense that I didn't feel so alone, that my experience wasn't unique, but rather part of a systemic structure of power that perhaps didn't grant me the same kinds of access to my peers or to other folks that have been living here for a long time. So this is all to say that I think there's ways in which we can see ourselves in media that are deeply reassuring and that provide forms of understanding our lives and seeing our lives reflected. Whether that is the same for everyone, I don't know, but the show did really well. So perhaps it's also a window into seeing what is life when one stands outside of the margins. So not only a show for people like me, but a show for other folks who might want to understand that experience. Plus the writing was really excellent and the show was really funny. So I'm sure it had a really, really wide audience.
One of the things that fascinates me about your work on gender representation, again, going back to looking at your syllabi, is that you make this jump from Hollywood and film representation to dictatorship and resistance in Latin America. So could we talk about that kind of women's representation and activism, particularly in terms, again, of your specialty in film?
Yes, there's a broad range of ways that women are represented. And to my mind, in terms of putting these two things together, I think of my research as a way to understand the ways that film and media address and represent experiences of marginalization. And here I'm thinking not only about gender, but race and ethnicity, class and political ideology, basically human rights writ large in Latin America and its diaspora. So there's a way that women, Latin American women and Latinx women appear represented in myriad ways throughout the history of cinema, and particularly after dictatorship in Argentina, I think there's also kind of an arc of how women appear represented. You have even in a film like Teoría Oficial, seems to act as a sort of microcosm of representation. You have the kind of clueless and somewhat complicit character, the mother that seems to come to terms with the fact that her daughter might be a stolen baby of a desaparecido couple, to the depiction of women's critical efforts of resistance through the work of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo or the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, which appear in the same film as the motor to the demands for justice, and how they're key to the protagonist kind of reckoning with the recent past. So even in one film from 1985, you have this wide range of representations, but this is starting also to show up in different ways. We can see it in how much women have shown up behind the camera in post-dictatorship Argentina. You have Lucrecia Martel, Lucia Puenzo, Paula Hernandez. They're starting to be a bit of a larger critical mass. And I think that eventually this is going to change the way that women appear represented. And it has already started in many ways.
Have you seen Argentina 1985?
I have seen it.
And how do you feel about the representation of women there?
That is a broad question, June. That is a broad question. I think that the film reflects in many ways the role that women have had in Argentina, and particularly women at that time. I think that the focus on the legal process did not allow for a lot of room for women to be brought to the forefront. And I don't think that it's exemplary in that way, but also I don't think that in many ways that period was exemplary in the way that women have had room to contribute. The pockets of resistance that exist through the mothers, through the grandmothers, to other people who took the streets was hard fought.
Thank you for that answer. In your life before Harvard, you worked in Hollywood yourself and participated in the study from Latin America to Hollywood, Latino Film Culture in Los Angeles, 1967 to 2017. That was aiming to increase Latin American, Latinx representation in popular media. Could you give us a couple of takeaways from what you found?
When I joined this project, it was a really, really difficult time for the Academy, because a few months after I joined, the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite began trending. This was not a surprise for me, let me just say, but it was exactly why I joined, to try to kind of move things from the inside, to try to change things from the inside, even if it were marginally. I didn't have any delusions that I would change the world. So as part of this project, I worked with a team to produce oral histories of Latin American and Latinx people who have had really important contributions to film history. And of the 13 interviews that we conducted, 5 are with women. This is more than expected in terms of like looking at other comparable projects, but not reflective of the industry. So foregrounding the work of women in many ways was a concerted effort by the co-curator, the fantastic filmmaker Lourdes Portillo, who lived through the difficulties of transiting the industry as a woman herself. So one of the big takeaways for me is that there are pockets where this so-called diversity lives. In this way, the paradigm has not shifted. So like foregrounding the work of Latin American, Latinx, and women creators and the intersections of that is something that makes these people stand out outside of the norm rather than being part of this norm. So that's really not how we're going to create meaningful change. So these are indispensable conversations that, to my mind, are being had in both academic and industry spaces. Like I was reading recently that Annenberg Inclusion Initiative study. They're conducting a study on inclusion in entertainment, and they articulated something that we all kind of know anecdotally, that the percentage of women on screen has not really moved in decades. And I would venture to say that this is also true in production aspects and behind the camera. So that was part of the goals of that project, to try to show the kind of creative excellence that not only the Latin American and Latinx creators are bringing to the table, but also that part of this group is women who are a force.
You finished the Hollywood study in 2017. What's happened since then? Do you think things have improved? Have they gone backwards? What's happening?
They haven't changed as fast as I would like them to. Since I was reading this Annenberg report, I will lean on that. So let's look at an imperfect measure like the Oscars. So the Annenberg report analyzed the 95 years since the award was born and found that women's work has mostly gone unrecognized. Again, not surprising. Where there are gains, it's pretty heavily skewed to the prominence of women in acting awards, which of course is reasonable because there are devoted categories to women actors. When you take out the performance awards, where there are gains, it's mostly along stereotypical roles like costume design. So make that of what you will, right? But the report, I think, zeroes in on this really important thing, which is the lack of acknowledgement for women's creative excellence speaks to the longstanding dismissal of women's work across the film industry. And I would have to agree with that. I think the statistics are even worse when it comes to recognizing the work of women of color, which the report calls abysmal. And I think we're starting to see a slow upward trend in the recognition that women are getting within the industry. But the percentage of women nominees, for example, doesn't even come close to the percentage of women in the industry or women in society. So still lots of things need to change.
Wow, lots of things need to change. And this is Women's International History Month. So do you have any final thoughts on where we're going?
I have hope about where we're going. And I hope that women, and particularly Latin American and Latinx women, can move into the spotlight and that we are given our due for the incredible contributions, not only in the film industry, and in academia and in society. So I'll just manifest that.
Thank you. We've been listening to Jennifer Alpert. She's a lecturer in history and literature at Harvard. She teaches, among other subjects, about the representation of gender in film and television in the Americas. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, June. It's been a pleasure.